The year 2001 marks the 300th anniversary of the raising of the 35th Regiment of Foot, the forebear of the Royal Sussex Regiment. Amalgamated to form the Queen's Regiment in 1966, its name lives on through the Regimental Association, its museum and its archives. This video honours all who served in the regiment. The city of Chichester is in many ways the home of the Royal Sussex Regiment. Here, within its ancient cathedral, is the Regimental Memorial Chapel of St George. Dedicated in 1921, the chapel reflects the proud history of the regiment, symbolised in the regimental badge on the screen and in the regimental colours hanging from its walls. It represents duty, service and sacrifice. The panels around its south and west walls list, battalion by battalion, those who died in the First World War. A roll of honour book by the altar records the names of those who fell in the Second. Every year, on St George's Day, a regimental memorial service is held in the chapel. Old comrades gather to remember fellow soldiers of the regiment and friends they once knew. It is attended by the President of the Regimental Association, here receiving his rose, and is conducted by the Dean of Chichester.
Now, whilst this great cathedral stands, so too will the memory of comrades of the Royal Sussex Regiment. Memories are written down in official histories and individual biographies. They are still passed by word of mouth. Remember old Bill? What an awful day it was near Amiens in 1940. Most of you have tales to tell, and they are summed up, many of them, on these boards in this chapel of St George.
For many, the tales will be of service overseas, but Chichester too will hold memories, many linked to the regimental depot, which for almost 90 years, until its closure in 1960, was based in the barracks north of the city. Its appearance may have changed from their days as regular army recruits or national servicemen in the 50s. Now it is the home of the Royal Military Police, but still there will be much to remind them of their time at the depot. An avenue named after General Whistler, a wartime commander and former colonel of the regiment. Sandhurst Block, first provided for the accommodation of other ranks in 1939. The new quarters of the officer commanding the depot, which replaced the old wooden building in 1952. The millstone sundial set on the edge of the green, where sports and parades were held. And the chapel, now with an impressive stained glass window to commemorate the regiment's lengthy tenure of the barracks. But the history of the regiment predates its long association with Chichester, and it is to Eastbourne along the Sussex coast that we must go if we are to take the story back beyond living memory. There has been a regimental museum since 1930, first at the depot and then in Chichester Museum, but today it'll be found at the Redoubt Fortress on the seafront at Eastbourne. A circular stronghold, built in the Napoleonic Wars, the rooms or casemates leading off from the central parade ground now house the impressive Military Museum of Sussex. 5 casemates are devoted to the regiment, 3 centuries of paintings, uniforms, weapons and equipment. Richard Callaghan is the curator.
Of the museum's 20,000 visitors per year, a large proportion are ex-members of the services, and of those, the vast majority from the local area are ex-members of the Royal Sussex Regiment. The town and the county is justly proud of these former servicemen, and we try to instill a great sense of pride into the displays we have.
Displays such as these shakos, caps and helmets of the regular, volunteer and militia battalions of the regiment. Outstanding individual collections such as the uniforms and insignia of Brigadier Sir Geoffrey MacNab. An officer with the regiment after the First World War, he later transferred to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders and subsequently enjoyed a distinguished career in the diplomatic service. Portraits of the colonels of the regiment. Campaign and gallantry medals, securely but accessibly stored. Special showcases such as this First World War display of weaponry captured by the 9th Battalion at Ravine Wood near Ypres. Or the magnificent set of silver drums presented to the regiment at Brighton in 1962 by the Duke of Norfolk on behalf of the people of Sussex. The story begins in Belfast in 1701 with the 35th Regiment of Foot. It was raised by Arthur Chichester, 3rd Earl of Donegal, to support the Protestant King William III, seen here in this painting by the Dutch artist Jan de Bain. Early uniforms included a red coat, faced and lined with orange, as a mark of royal favour. The black cocked hat was worn by all ranks except grenadiers. A painting by John Smibert of General Charles Otway, colonel of the regiment, 1717–64. The regiment lost its first colonel, the Earl of Donegal, in the Wars of the Spanish Succession, in which it gained its first battle honour. For much of Otway's time, it remained in Ireland. In 1756, it went to North America for the 7 Years' War. Many were massacred by Indians at Fort William Henry, a story told in Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. It was at the capture of Louisbourg and fought under Wolfe at Quebec. At Quebec, on 13 September 1759, the 35th defeated the Royal Roussillon Regiment of France. They put the white plume worn by their adversaries in their own hats. It would later be incorporated in the regimental badge. The regiment returned to North America for the War of Independence in 1775. It fought at Bunker Hill, a rare victory in a disastrous campaign. The first real connection with Sussex came in 1787 when Charles Lennox, later 4th Duke of Richmond, joined and recruited from the Goodwood estates. He became colonel of the regiment and won royal approval for the title 35th or Sussex Regiment of Foot. A print of the Battle of Maida, a famous victory over Napoleon's army in 1806. On the right, flankers of the 35th wade through a river. In the centre, Colonel Oswald uses a spyglass. The Maida Gold Medal awarded to Major Robertson can be seen at the museum. During the Napoleonic Wars, a 2nd battalion was raised and was in reserve at Waterloo. The regiment now served for a long spell in the Caribbean, and on its return home in 1832 was given the title Royal by William IV. Orange facings gave way to the blue of a Royal Regiment, and the title became the 35th Royal Sussex Regiment of Foot. After the Indian Mutiny in 1857, the regiment became linked with the 107th Bengal Infantry Regiment, whose officers are shown here in an early photograph. An officer of the 107th, John Carstairs MacNeill, won the first of the regiment's 6 Victoria Crosses, on attachment during the Maori Wars in 1864. Officers of the 35th and 107th at Chichester Barracks. Built in the Napoleonic Wars, the barracks had been used by many infantry and cavalry units, but in 1873 became the home depot of the 2 regiments. In 1881, the 35th and 107th were reconstituted as the 1st and 2nd Battalions, the Royal Sussex Regiment. Captain Lionel Trafford kept an illustrated journal of the 1st Battalion's adventures in the Sudan. After battles at El Teb and Tamay, the battalion was sent up the Nile to relieve General Gordon at Khartoum. A force, including 250 Royal Sussex, was mounted on camels to cut across the desert from Korti to Metemma. At Abu Klea, they encountered fierce fighting. The British formed a square. The Arabs broke through the rear wall. The Royal Sussex helped drive them off. Trafford's watercolour of one of the steamers on which he and 20 Royal Sussex now made the final dash to Khartoum in January 1885. Their gallant efforts were in vain. The garrison and General Gordon had fallen. The 2nd Battalion was in India, its officers pictured here in the Black Mountain expedition of 1888. On the far left, Lieutenant Montresor, who in 1914 would command the battalion on the Western Front. After its return home, the Duke of Norfolk unveiled a memorial on the seafront at Eastbourne to those of the battalion who had died in India, Egypt and Malta between 1882 and 1902. India in particular provided good training, but there were casualties, not only from encounters with rebellious tribesmen on the northwest frontier, but also through sickness. The Boer War took the 1st Battalion to South Africa in 1900. It was reinforced by the 3rd Militia Battalion, seen here marching down North Street in Chichester on the first stage of its journey to South Africa. The regulars were also reinforced by 3 companies from the volunteer battalions of the regiment. This was the first time the volunteers had served their country overseas. Sir Walter Bartelott, commanding 1st Company, was amongst the casualties, killed at Retief's Neck in 1900. As the conflict degenerated into guerrilla warfare, Colonel Dumoulin formed a Royal Sussex column of mounted infantry to pursue the Boer commandos. There is a silver statuette of a mounted infantryman at the Regimental Museum. Dumoulin was killed in a Boer raid in January 1902, and the column was broken up. He was one of 3 officers and 160 other ranks who died during the war. A memorial was unveiled in Regency Square, Brighton, in October 1904. During the First World War, the regiment expanded to 23 battalions. The 2nd Battalion, inspected by George V during manoeuvres at Aldershot. On horseback, with Generals Haig and Lomax, he talks to Colonel Montresor, who would take the battalion to France. The 2nd Battalion was amongst the first British troops landed in France. It fought through the war on the Western Front, at Ypres and the Somme, at Aubers Ridge and Loos, and finally on the Sambre Canal. It earned from the enemy the title the Iron Regiment, but not without cost. Colonel Montresor, an early casualty, killed on the Aisne in September 1914. The regulars of the 2nd Battalion would be joined at the front by the 5th Cinque Ports Battalion, territorials recruited from East Sussex. This battalion had been mobilised at the beginning of the war, and after a period of garrison duties at Dover Castle, was posted to the Tower of London in October 1914. Here it would undertake the duties of a Guards battalion, every night performing the ancient ceremony of the keys at the Tower. But soon came the news that it had been selected for service on the continent. Training for overseas active service now proceeded apace, and the battalion was visited at the Tower by a newsreel company to film footage of the territorials preparing for the front. In the first sequence, the camera follows the battalion's signallers, formed up in the courtyard, perfecting their art. The 5th Battalion was designated to join the 2nd Battalion in the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division, it now being the policy of Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, to reinforce the depleted and battle-weary British Expeditionary Force by adding a territorial battalion to each regular brigade. On the film, a company with fixed bayonets is inspected by its officer, and then the men are shown practising bayonet fighting. The battalion was organised into 4 double companies under the commanding officer, Colonel Frederick Langham. Here, the cameraman films a training exercise for the battalion's Vickers machine gun crews using high tripod mounts. Later, the newsreel finishes with 2 separate sessions of drill, taken firstly by an officer and then by a sergeant. On 16 February 1915, the battalion was inspected prior to proceeding overseas, and 2 days later entrained at Waterloo for Southampton. From there, on the SS Pancras, it embarked for France. Arriving at Havre, the men received a rousing reception as they marched to camp, headed by their bandsman. But darker times were ahead, for soon the battalion would see action, and sadly, for many men appearing on this film, there would be no return to their homes in the towns and villages of East Sussex. In this photograph, A Company, 5th Battalion, wait and watch in reserve trenches at Neuve-Chapelle in March. It was an attack designed to open the way for the capture of the key position of Aubers Ridge. The attack at Aubers Ridge on Sunday 9 May 1915 began with an artillery bombardment. Its failure to destroy trenches and wire left the 2nd and 5th Battalions prey to machine gun fire, their losses filtering home to local newspapers. The 2nd Battalion remained in the front line, and the Battle of Loos on 25 September 1915 brought the added horror of gas. It was here that Sergeant Harry Wells won a Victoria Cross, gallantly leading his platoon towards the German wire. This painting by Ernest Ibbotson is in the Regimental Museum. The Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously to Sergeant Wells, but Lieutenant Eric Archibald McNair of the 9th Battalion was presented with his medal at an investiture at Buckingham Palace in May 1916, following his valiant actions in the line at Hooge in Belgium. Both medals are now with the regiment, and in the archives are photographs of Wells on the right and McNair on the left, with citations, war diaries and trench maps relating to their brave deeds. The regular army was now supplemented by Lord Kitchener's service battalions, the product of his famous "Your country needs you" appeal. The first in Sussex was raised by Colonel Osborne, 25 years in the regiment, whose appeal was to county pride as much as national patriotism. It went over to France in May 1915 as the 7th Service Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. Here, a draft waits to entrain outside Chichester Station. The 3 battalions raised by Colonel Claude Lowther were perhaps the most deeply characteristic of the county. He is here, seated centre, with officers of the 11th Battalion at Couden, Bexhill. They were known as Lowther's Lambs, after the mascot, Peter the Lamb. Recruiting particularly from the downland villages and coastal towns of East Sussex, a strong kinship developed. Here, a group of Eastbourne pals posed for the camera at Couden Camp. In November 1914, a newsreel camera captured the arrival of Lowther's Lambs at Eastbourne railway station. They were cheered on their way by an enthusiastic crowd as they marched through the town, headed by their own brass band, to be addressed by the mayor at the Saffrons. Some were still in civilian clothes, but most now wore their first uniform, known as Kitchener Blues, khaki arriving early in 1915. They were entertained to tea in church halls across the town and assembled again for a recruiting rally on the seaside recreation ground in the evening before returning to Couden. After training, they left for France in March 1916 and on 30 June took part in the battle at Richebourg. The attack met fierce machine gun fire. In the morning, the 3 battalions lost 17 officers and 349 other ranks killed, and 3 times as many wounded. One was CSM Nelson Victor Carter. An Eastbourne man, he was awarded a posthumous VC for his bravery that day. The town of Bray on the Somme as troops move up to the front. The Allies, boosted by the arrival of Kitchener's new army divisions, selected the Somme Valley as the site for the Big Push, designed to break through the German lines and restart a war of movement. 8 battalions of the Royal Sussex Regiment would be drawn into the Battle of the Somme during the summer and autumn of 1916. The offensive began with a massive 7-day bombardment of German positions, but again the failure of the artillery to achieve its objectives would prove costly. Once more the infantry were left vulnerable to machine gun and small arms fire as they attempted to cross no man's land. Scenes in the communication trenches as the men fix bayonets and move up to the line. On the first day, Saturday 1 July 1916, 66,000 went over the top on a British front of 16 miles. By the end of the day, 19,000 had been killed, many more wounded. Attention focuses on that first day, but the Battle of the Somme would last 140 days, until the middle of November. For the Royal Sussex, we can draw on letters and diaries written at the front, plus the official battalion war diaries. But for film footage, we must turn to the Battle of the Somme, the world's first war documentary, shot by Geoffrey Malins and J.B. McDowell. Soldiers climb out of a shallow trench and prepare to advance across no man's land. Amongst all the authentic filming, a few scenes were staged and some stock footage was used, but there is no denying the underlying truthfulness of the film. Sequences such as these made a great impact at home and are now part of the classic imagery of the Great War. Bringing in the wounded during the height of battle. Sergeant Charles Tullett's 7th Battalion was one of the wounded. His words give a chilling insight into the battle. I still went on. Many poor chaps were being bowled over like ninepins. To see the dead and dying, hearing the cries of the wounded, was terrifying. Amongst the Royal Sussex Battalions on the Somme in 1916 were the pioneers of the 5th Cinque Ports Battalion. Their duties included digging trenches and laying tracks, often under sniper fire. Here, in another War Office film, Sons of Our Empire, they are seen in column of fours, some smiling, some more resigned, as they march down a tree-lined road in a Somme village. 11th Battalion officers, June 1917, the eve of Passchendaele. They had moved to Ypres after the Somme. All were old boys of Christ Hospital. Edmund Blunden, front right, would write Undertones of War, a classic account of the trench war. Our insight into the soldier's life at the front is enhanced too by the journals of the Arundel artist Ralph Ellis of the 7th Battalion. His sketches of the men with whom he served and drawings of the battlefields are in the county archives. The regiment's 4th V.C. of the war was awarded to Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Johnson, here with his runner Sergeant Brown. He was attached from the South Wales Borderers and decorated for his leadership of the 2nd Battalion at the crossing of the Sambre Canal on 4 November 1918. Through the war, the spirits of the men were lifted by their marching song, Sussex by the Sea. The words and music were composed by William Ward Higgs in 1904, in honour of the marriage of his sister-in-law to Captain Roland Waithman of the 2nd Battalion. At the time, he lived at Hollywood House in Bognor. A plaque commemorates a song which today remains as popular as ever at events organised by the Regimental Association. The Western Front may dominate, but the war took the regiment to other fronts, including Gallipoli. The plan was to occupy the peninsula, send the navy through the Dardanelles, and break the power of Turkey. The campaign involved the 4th Battalion, territorials recruited mainly from West Sussex. The first invasion in April 1915 met strong resistance. The 4th Royal Sussex went out on the Ulysses as part of a fresh initiative, landing at Suvla Bay in August. It was a desperate campaign, and in December the expedition was withdrawn. The 4th Battalion now joined the 16th Yeomanry Battalion in the Egyptian force and the advance into Palestine. Here the 4th marched through Bethlehem in December 1917. One tragedy in its story was the torpedoing of the troopship Transylvania, carrying reinforcements, mostly bootmakers from Kettering. An intriguing aspect of the regiment's war is the role it played in Russia. The 11th Battalion came home from the Western Front in June 1918, only to be ordered to join the North Russian Relief Force. This was sent out to protect the British garrison at Murmansk and Archangel until the revolution had run its course. The barren wastes and Arctic temperatures took their toll. The graves of some were rediscovered only recently in a former cemetery. We have this War Office footage and an illustrated diary kept by Sergeant Chesham. He describes the Arctic clothing issued to the Royal Sussex on the advice of Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton: fur hats, fur-lined overcoats and snow boots. Travelling, other than slowly, required skis, and the men were trained in their use by Canadian instructors. According to Sergeant Chesham, skiing was taken up with great enthusiasm by all ranks, and many became experts. The Northern Lights and the quaint customs of the Russian Laplanders had their appeal, and he was impressed by the speed of the reindeer and sleigh, their principal means of transport. Nonetheless, doubtless all were pleased when in August 1919 the time came for the 11th Battalion to return home for demobilisation at last. For the Royal Sussex Regiment, the First World War was finally over. The Duke of Gloucester, in uniform, meets the Mayor and Alderman of Chichester, and before them 3 ex-Royal Sussex Chelsea pensioners, at the depot in June 1928. He was accompanied by Lord Leconfield, the Lord Lieutenant, and by Brigadier General Osborne, Colonel of the regiment. The occasion was the consecration and presentation of new colours to the 1st Battalion. It had spent the war in India, but for much of the interwar period it would remain in home stations. The picturesque surroundings of the Green provided an ideal setting for the ceremony, which was watched by the territorials of the 4th and 5th Battalions. Films such as these offer fleeting views of the barracks as it was in former days. The old colours had seen 68 years' service, and in the afternoon were laid up in St George's Chapel. The battalion, preceded by the band, marched from the barracks to the cathedral, and are seen here in West Street. The streets were packed in honour of the regiment. Some remained behind as a cameraman used up his film, and perhaps stopped for an ice cream. A unique view of life with the regiment between the wars is given by the films of Major Cyril Peckett. This footage was taken in 1929-30 when he was adjutant at the depot. Sport played a key part in the life of the depot and in the training of recruits. Football, hockey, cricket and boxing were all popular. Teams competed in local leagues and army championships, and occasionally outstanding individuals represented the county and the army. Physical training and gymnastics, clearly, were entered into with gusto and had their outlet in displays presented at galas and fetes throughout the county. Clips such as these, shot on the Green, also give tantalising glimpses in the background of how the barracks looked in the late 20s. Vaulting at the High Horse was the preserve of the permanent staff and selected recruits, according to the regimental journal, the Roussillon Gazette. An annual sports meeting was held at the depot in late May or early June. Recruits were organised into squads, named after regimental battle honours. Here Peckett films the 1930 meeting. Recruiting was not easy between the wars. Neither the economic situation nor the political climate were in its favour. Displays like this at the Army Recruiting Office in Chichester helped, and in 1933 Colonel Foster led the 1st Battalion on a recruiting march through Sussex. The opportunity to recruit in the home county was presented to the regiment by the decision to march the 12th Infantry Brigade from the barracks in Dover to camp in Arundel Park. The usual mode of travel was motor or rail, but marching was part of the economy regime imposed on the army in the depressed 30s. The 1st Battalion was detached from the main body and is seen here on the last stage from Shoreham to Arundel, receiving an enthusiastic welcome in Worthing. While the 1st Battalion was largely at home, the 2nd Battalion went across the world in the interwar period, first to the West Indies, then Malta, confrontation with the Turks in Chenak, and then to Singapore and India. The 2nd Battalion was in India from 1926 to 1935. Major Peckett was posted from the 1st Battalion in December 1932. He left for India with a draft from Southampton on the troop ship Dorsetshire. In company with the Somersetshire and the Lancashire, the ship was used regularly by the regiment to take troops out to India and, on the return journey, to bring back to England time-expired men and others transferred to the home establishment. Peckett's films of the 2nd Battalion in India provide a unique record of the life of the regiment on the subcontinent in the latter days of the Empire.